Hello, English 102 students. This is a video to go over the nature of tragedy and also to get started on Ibsen. So let's go ahead and do the slideshow from the beginning. And of course, feel free to pause this or rewind, whatever you need to do as we're watching the video. Okay, so if I can expand this a little bit. Nope, doesn't look like it. Okay, so that's old Heinrich. That's how it's pronounced in Norwegian. But before we get into Ibsen, what I really want to talk about first is the nature of tragedy. Tragedy is a very, very old form of drama. It originated in ancient Greece, at least the Western tradition. And plays in general really started with a chorus of singers that would sing a song or chant a song about, say, Hercules or the Trojan War, or a story that was well known to the Greeks. Now, as it developed further, as part of this religious festival, it became a competition between playwrights. And as we know, competition often brings out innovation, and this was no different. There was a lot of innovation in terms of adding characters, adding scenery, adding types of things that they would do in the plays. As I mentioned, they added more actors and things like this. And this was in the spring festival of Dionysus, who's the goddess of wine and fertility and, general debauchery overall. Okay, so tragedy, what's the point? Because some of you might be saying, well, why would I want to watch something that's sad? What's the point? Well, Aristotle was alive during kind of the heyday of Greek theater. And he wrote a bunch about Greek theater. Now, if you have me for English 101, you would know that Aristotle also wrote a lot about rhetoric, or the art of making an argument. But the point of tragedy, according to Aristotle, can be to show us something important: the dangers of pride, incest, greed, indecision, corruption. One of the plays you may have already read, but it's taught in World Lit, is Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the king. And that shows the dangers of going against what the gods say you should do. In terms of, say, Hamlet, in Elizabethan world, his uncle marrying his mother, even though they're not blood relatives, was considered incestual to the Elizabethans. So often the hero of the tragedy will have a tragic flaw that will influence the action. Okay, so what's a tragic flaw? A tragic flaw is usually a blind spot of some sort in an otherwise good person that ends up being a tragedy. If you've ever read Macbeth, for example, his ambition kind of gets a fire lit under it at the beginning of the play, and that ambition leads him to his tragedy. With Hamlet, he can't decide what to do, and that delay causes problems for him. But you see this in modern movies as well, where you have a hero that may be flawed, and it ends up being bad for them, even though if we're entertained by the work overall. Okay, so when we see something important like this, according to Aristotle, it creates what he called catharsis. Catharsis is purging negative emotions. So Elios, pity, and phobos, fear. Phobia, we've all heard that word. But by purging these negative emotions, we can be better people in our daily lives. For those of you that did my Stephen King assignment, where what's why we crave horror movies. It's based on an essay by Stephen King, where he basically says we go to horror movies, to prove we can, but also, there's kind of this human need to see this sort of stuff. I think Aristotle would agree. This is a constructive way to purge negative emotions. All right, so it can make us feel good afterwards. I think the modern equivalent is more often than not is maybe for a lot of guys and some women, like say the Fast and the Furious movies, where you have explosions and you have people perhaps getting killed or kind of guy movie things, stereotypically. It can lift a bad mood. By the same token, if you break up with someone, you might want to watch a romance, The Notebook. I'm not real affluent in romantic movies, but the idea behind maybe even tragic love stories, Romeo and Juliet, for example, is to make us feel better afterwards. Okay? So think about that as you're reading A Dollhouse. How can it stimulate good thoughts or important thoughts after we've seen it? Okay, so that's kind of the background on tragedy. What you really need to remember is tragic flaws and purging of negative emotions. So let's talk about Heinrich Ibsen. He was a Norwegian playwright. And I'm going to get to his birthday in a minute, but it was an important time when he was born. But he's considered the father of modern drama for a lot of reasons. He challenged societal rules and government. Shakespeare couldn't anger the power structure. He had to have his plays approved by a lord who sponsored his acting troupe. But Ibsen said, no, I'm not going to have somebody tell me my plays are appropriate or not. I'm going to write what I want and try to create something powerful, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. Okay? If you think about it, we've got a lot of these in the modern world. What's his name? Keegan Peele makes some powerful movies about racial relations, for example. They can really kind of trace their lineage to Ibsen, because what he created was something called a problem play, in which a societal problem was examined and scrutinized. And we still have movies like this today. If you take a close look at a societal problem, Brokeback Mountain, for example. Regardless of what you think of the movie, the purpose of this movie is to show how two people who were raised a certain way have to deal with the love that they have for each other, even though it is deemed by their culture as improper or incorrect. And these types of works tend to be important because they make us look at our own thoughts and feelings. Now, as I mentioned before, Ibsen came of age at a time of great political change. In 1847 to 1849, but primarily 1848, there were revolutions all over Europe where people said, we're tired of having kings and noblemen rule our world completely. We think we should have some democracy, at least. And you saw revolutions in Germany, in Italy, in some of the Balkan states. And what this created, it was kind of like a counterculture movement, like in the 60s in the United States, where people said, no, we need a change to what we're doing. And this is when Ibsen was 19, 20 years old, and it was very influential on him in his life and his writing. Okay, so let's think about some of the societal issues that are going to be important to this play. Women had almost no power. They had to get their husband's permission to do many things, sometimes as bad as like just going to the grocery store. But certainly, as we're going to see with Nora, to get a loan, to borrow money, and that sort of stuff. There was also, at this time, the notion of social Darwinism, where the sins of the father or the mother would automatically be passed on to the children. So if your father gambled too much or had a gambling problem, you couldn't help it. You were automatically going to have a gambling problem. It's almost like some of the free will was taken out of people. But if you had a bad mother, that means you were going to be a bad mother. And we can kind of see how these things or these ideas got developed because you see a lot of examples of it. But of course we know it's not true, that people can make a choice to not be alcoholics, gambling addicts, bad parents, all that sort of stuff. Also, there was this notion at the time, and this was really started in the early 19th century, and it was an actual book that was written called The Angel in the House. And the idea behind The Angel in the House was that men were morally weak in a lot of areas, and were prone to drinking, carousing, maybe going to a whorehouse occasionally, that sort of thing. Okay, remember, women were property of their husbands in most Western countries. So the idea of the angel in the house was, it was the job of the wife and mother to be the angel in the house, to, when her husband goes astray, to bring him back into the moral fold. Okay, also to be this shining example for her children. All right, so it was kind of believed in this society that if a mother, or excuse me, if the children turned out bad, it was the mother's fault, not the father's, because she was supposed to be responsible for the moral upbringing of children, and also for the moral checks and balances with the husband. Okay. Okay, so this is groundbreaking. This play was one of the first plays to show realism. If you think about Shakespeare, it doesn't show real people for the most part. It shows noble people. Now, granted, the Helmers in a Dollhouse certainly are well off, but they're not kings and queens and things like that. Also, they showed life as it is. Excuse me. There was kind of a pseudo-reality in plays before this, where, the bad guy always got his comeuppance, where, the hero was always successful. We don't necessarily see that in modern plays. Holds a mirror up to society. Ibsen's goal in a lot of cases is to say, this is wrong. We need to fix it. But as we know, if you challenge something that everybody takes for granted, there's going to be pushback. Makes an uncomfortable statement about the society that Ibsen lived in. And that's about how women are treated and how women are kind of kept in the dark about a lot of things that are important in life. Now, do take a note on the title. The movie version we're going to watch has a doll's possessive house. In Norwegian, it's a house for a doll. So a doll house, the physical structure, fits the Norwegian word better. But as we think about it, if it's a doll's house, possessive, Nora would be possessing the house, and that doesn't really make sense with the play. So it's like we're watching people living in a dollhouse. Okay, so as you're reading the play, look for symbolism. What's important? It's at Christmas time. Think of all the things that are wrapped up in Christmas. Tragic flaw. What's Nora's tragic flaw? In this case, the event that really affects how the play ends up has already happened. Character growth. Who changes? Who grows? Who develops? An awakening or an epiphany. Who discovers something new about themselves. What societal issues do we see here? Reputation is a big deal here, and I think Ibsen didn't care for how much stock people put into reputation at this time. How do we purge that pity and fear, negative emotions? How do we get rid of them as we're watching the play? Okay, so what I want you to do is to take a look at, first 5, 6 pages of the play. You can read them, and then I would advise to watch them on film and see how you see these issues kind of popping up. If you have any questions about A Doll's House or A Dollhouse or Ibsen in general, please let me know. But let's go ahead and dive into this full-length play.